I'd like to welcome people to this forum by the Bolshevik Tendency. The topic is China Capitalists. We're going to have a presentation for about 35 minutes by a Bolshevik Tendency comrade. Then we'll have a discussion round following that, and then we'll have a summary of about 15 minutes, and our aim is to go for about 2 hours in total. For those who haven't been to one of our meetings before, we use the Zoom webinar feature, not the meeting feature, so that when you're about to speak in the discussion round, you'll get changed to a panelist, and during that period, you'll be briefly disconnected and reconnected. And then after you finish speaking, you'll be put back to be an attendee, as Zoom calls them. And once again, there'll be a short disconnection before you're reconnected as an attendee. When it gets to the discussion, we will ask people to use the raise hand feature, and I'll note you down in the audio taken. We will be recording the meeting and the discussion, but we will be just publishing that as an audio. But if you don't want to be heard speaking, you may leave a message in the chat, sending that to all panelists, and I will read out your question for you. It's up to you when you are selected to speak, whether you want to turn on your video or not. And I think that's all. So now we'll start.
China has become of increased interest to the outside world due to its meteoric rise and the simultaneous decline of US imperialism. This raises the question of why and how a country governed by a communist party has managed to reach such heights. When discussing these developments, we need to consider the mode of production that has permitted the Middle Kingdom to outpace virtually every imperialist power in terms of growth over the last 40 years, but particularly since the last two major capitalist crises in 2008 and 2020. China's economic rise accelerated after Deng Xiaoping famously took over the teetering edifice of the Chinese Communist Party after Mao's death and introduced market measures which have seemingly confirmed Francis Fukuyama's view about how capitalism marked the highest stage in human development. The overwhelming majority of the left has bought into the myth that this spectacular economic growth must have been caused by the market. It has justified its stance by asserting that China has undergone a capitalist counter-revolution equal to that of the Soviet Union in 1991, by pointing to the sweatshop conditions which much of the Chinese working class had to endure, and many still endure, particularly in the provinces with higher market penetration, such as Guangdong, combined with rising social inequalities expressed in the highest numbers of billionaires in global comparison. Not long ago, the capitalist business press wrote about how the CCP only had to reform the state-owned enterprises a bit more and grant a bit more market access, and China would become some sort of model capitalist state. Chinese nationalist writer Wang Xiaodong noted, however, that Western observers tended to quote only Chinese academics who agreed with their perspective, rather than paying closer attention to the actual debates in Chinese society and the practical outcomes of these. There are some developments that the capitalist press and imperialist governments in the Western world and Tokyo are particularly uneasy about. It is the stalling and partial rollback of the very market measures they assumed would continue to expand linearly and culminate in capitalist counter-revolution. In recognition that this might no longer be a realistic perspective short-term, American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently proclaimed that if the free world doesn't change communist China will change us. Yet the Trump administration is not the first in taking an increasingly militarized stance against the People's Republic. A decade ago, Hillary Clinton called the South China Sea a sphere of US national interest, and President Obama used his time in office to shift US military might more decisively to surround China in his pivot to Asia. More recently, Joe Biden prides himself of wanting to be harder on China and Russia than Trump. It is uncontroversial to state that we are dealing with a country in which both the market and the state sector have been existing side by side, but in which the governmental structures have not fundamentally changed since Mao's 1949 revolution. The World Trotskyist movement agreed that the CCP's victory over the bourgeois nationalist Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek turned China into a defunct worker state. The CCP effectively used the degenerated Soviet Union under Stalin as a blueprint to model its society. It smashed the bourgeois state apparatus. The bourgeoisie fled to the British colony of Hong Kong or the province of Taiwan, so that there was no real bourgeois counterpower left in the country. It eventually nationalized all key industries and set up bureaucratic economic plans and, with a few exceptions, isolated itself from the outside world. Trotsky described defunct worker states like China in relation to the Soviet Union in his 1936 book, The Revolution Betrayed, as, quote unquote, a contradictory society halfway between capitalism and socialism, in which A, the productive forces are still far from adequate to give the state property a socialist character, B, the tendency toward primitive accumulation created by want breaks through the innumerable pores of the planned economy, C, norms of distribution preserving a bourgeois character lie at the basis of a new differentiation of society, D, the economic growth, while slowly bettering the situation of the toilers, promotes the swift formation of privileged strata, E, exploiting the social antagonisms, a bureaucracy has converted itself into an uncontrolled caste alien to socialism, F, the social revolution betrayed by the ruling party still exists in property relations and in the consciousness of the toiling masses, G, the further development of the accumulating contradictions can as well lead to socialism as back to capitalism, H, on the road to capitalism, the counter-revolution would have to break the resistance of the workers, I, on the road to socialism, the workers would have to overthrow the bureaucracy. In the last analysis, the question will be decided by a struggle of living social forces, both on the national and the world arena, end of quote. In order to determine whether such a description is accurate today, even since the imposition of Deng's market reforms, we should consider the varied forms in which both worker states and capitalist ones have used the state sector so far. When the American Trotskyist movement in the late 1930s debated the class nature of the Soviet Union, Trotsky reflected on the fact that even though in 1918 the Communist Party had not yet had the time to reorganize the economy after the October Revolution, Russia had become a worker state nonetheless, because the CP in power intended to carry out such steps. In other words, in early 1918, Russia's economy was still entirely capitalist, but yet no communist at the time would have doubted that Russia had become a worker state, and neither did the international bourgeoisie for that matter. There was a clear change in state power, and that is central for our question today. In the following years, the Communist Party first embarked on so-called war communism, in which the economy was almost entirely collectivized in order to survive the civil war. This resulted in severe hunger because there were no incentives for the peasants to produce anymore. The little they managed to produce was often seized by communists in order to feed the starving urban population. As a result, the Communist Party adopted the so-called new economic policy. The NEP reintroduced controlled and limited capitalist measures without surrendering state control over the economy in order to generate incentives for the predominantly peasant population to produce again. In describing the calculus behind these measures, Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, the leading economist of Trotsky's left opposition in the early and mid-1920s, pointed out that the reintroduction of market measures would result in a struggle between the planned state economy and the law of value represented by capitalist peasants and foreign capital, on which the young, fragile Soviet Union still depended. He pointed out that the capitalist law of value can only entirely disappear at a stage at which the forces of production have ripened to such an extent that economic planners understand in their entirety the allocation of labor for each single product produced and the abolition of the need to exchange goods in any unconscious way. But in the meantime, in the painful transitional stage, worker states can utilize market measures in a restricted way in an attempt to compensate for economic backwardness and in order to build the planned state economy whilst guarding against the dangers that the market poses to the worker state. And in addition, the state sector, Preobrazhensky wrote, can be fortified against the private one by organizing the state-owned enterprises as one unit, despite their formal existence as separate entities, in which the state apparatus keeps even commercially unviable SOEs afloat if it deems that to be necessary. In practice, every single one of the defunct worker states that have emerged over the past 75 years have at one point or another toyed with market measures in order to increase productivity with varying levels of success. Doing so did not turn their economies into capitalist ones, as the party and not the law of value decided upon the allocation of resources in the greater picture. At the other end of the spectrum, capitalist states have used state measures. The German war industry during World War I is an extreme example, which temporarily replaced the anarchic competition of private capital with a state-planned mechanism with the aim of preserving profitability in the long run. During recent crises, capitalist governments have bailed out banks and part nationalized some of these temporarily. Not even the most ardent neoliberals would assert that these measures had introduced communism. Naturally, such capitalist state measures and nationalizations will always be rolled back as soon as the danger to bourgeois rule has dissipated. The vital question for us then, in determining China's class character, is one of proportions of the state-planned economy versus the law of value, and whether it is political decision-making or the law of value that dominates resource allocation in the economy. One of Deng's most important steps was to invite foreign capital in, at first to restricted places called special economic zones. This permitted multinational corporations to benefit from the well-educated and highly diligent but very low-paid workforce, and to use China as a low-wage manufacturing platform for products which they would then re-export back into the imperialist world. But in turn, the onshoring of foreign capital provided Beijing with access to modern technology, which was unable to invent or develop domestically at that stage. However, at no time did the CCP grant entirely free access to foreign enterprises to invest and take over parts of the Chinese economy. The government granted access to multinationals with a particular expertise in certain technologies, which could then be emulated in order to use these investors to provide jobs in a bid to counter unemployment. The CCP regulates who enters the country and in what particular sector these companies wanting to set up shop are permitted to invest, which the party ensures also coincides in many cases with governmental economic plans. Beijing's restrictions have been a particular bugbear to imperialists and other foreign capital because it means that the economic drivers for furthering capitalist counter-revolution by creating a sufficiently broad social basis for capitalism are kept in check by the CCP. Another more recent phenomenon driving multinationals out of China are rising wages in the export industries operating for the capitalist world market. The workforce of these industries is usually recruited among migrant workers who do not want to endure the drudgery of small-scale agricultural work anymore. Nonetheless, they operate under horrendous working conditions of up to 14 hours per day, with few breaks and hardly any time off over the weekend. These conditions have resulted in massive strike action over the past decade, which in turn has managed to improve the living conditions for workers employed in this sector. The CCP, certainly no friend of independent working class organization, has become increasingly concerned about these strikes and has used the state-controlled All China Federation of Trade Unions to impose wage rises and other benefits for workers employed by foreign corporations. This, combined with the new tariffs imposed under Trump's trade war on imported goods from China, including those imported by American companies, has led to an exodus of foreign capitalists to countries with even worse working conditions, such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, and certain African countries. But in terms of absolute proportions, foreign capital in China currently accounts for no more than 1% of China's GDP. So far, the policy of opening up has played out in favor of the CCP. In a limited but increasing range of high-tech goods, such as 5G technology and solar panels, China has become a global leader. These developments underline that the CCP has been successful in modernizing the economy without ceding control to foreign capital. Yet it has been the working class, particularly the migrant workers, on whose backs this modernization program has been implemented. Another ingredient of Deng's market reforms was the privatization of a certain amount of state-owned enterprises and letting others go bankrupt in a bid to increase productivity in the remaining state sector. It has often been assumed that Deng's reforms would eventually lead to phasing out the state sector entirely. Yet today, it accounts for approximately 50% of China's GDP, and some say it's even more than that. According to multiple observers, such as the research institute Gavekau Dragonomics, the CCP started to step back from further privatization under Jiang Zemin in 2003. At the time, there was a huge uproar in Chinese society caused by an aspiring American-educated journalist, Larry Lang, who managed to get into the headlines by pointing out the corrupt privatization process of two state-owned enterprises, with the burden being shifted upon its workforce. This event became known as the Larry Lang storm. The support Lang received from the broader public resulted not only in him becoming a TV show host, but also in a change of heart for the CCP tops, who had become increasingly wary of the social instability caused by their privatization efforts. The China Labor Bulletin, certainly not a fan of CCP rule, noted that by 2006, the privatization effort of the state sector had pretty much stopped. Hu Jintao's government decreed a range of core industrial sectors as untouchable to the private sector, such as the military industry, electrical generation and grids, petroleum and petrochemicals, telecommunications, coal, civil aviation and shipping, whilst also keeping a heavy hand in other sectors, such as machinery, automobiles, IT, construction, steel and non-ferrous metals. If you take into account that land is effectively also in government hands, the economic power that the Chinese state wields vis-à-vis the private sector is considerable. The privatization of the remaining SOEs was not just stopped by class struggle either. Like in other deformed worker states, CCP bureaucrats used their control over the state sector to extract a cushy living for themselves above that of the working population. SOE managers and state planners, particularly in the inland provinces, have to rely on SOE performance and state financing of SOEs as their source of income, and have a direct material interest in maintaining these institutions. Having understood that capitalist counter-revolution in Soviet Russia ended in joblessness for many Communist Party apparatchiks, many CCP bureaucrats today are concerned that they might meet a similar fate should capitalism succeed in China. Another important lever to retain control over the economy is the CCP's grip on the financial system. The four biggest banks, by far, are all state-owned. Over 80% of the loans they issue go to SOEs. This trend has particularly picked up since Xi Jinping took over. Yet, state-owned enterprises are chronically performing worse than private capital. The growth rates and profitability of private capital is much higher than that of the state sector, and therefore state banks would make a far higher profit if they lent money to private businesses instead. The few loans they do issue to the private sector come at much higher interest rates. Elizabeth Economy noted in her book that SOEs have to repay loans at interest rates of approximately 4% on average, whilst the private sector is charged 9.9% interest on average to any loans given to them. In other words, not only does the state not seem too keen on issuing loans to the far more profitable private sector, it also extracts higher interest rates from the capitalists. This should perplex people who assert that China is a capitalist and that the CCP is a capitalist party. Why would you voluntarily sacrifice handsome profits you could make, not as a temporary emergency measure like that of the German government during World War I, but as a constant feature since the initiation of Deng's reforms, if you were chasing maximum returns on your investments, i.e., the things that capitalists do? Many SOEs are actually running at a deficit as well. As Walter and Howie point out in their book Red Capitalism, the banks are still lending to the state sector because the CCP tells them to. It does not matter if the SOEs are unable to repay the loans, so the banks are actually making a loss in those cases. When looking at the state sector and why some parts of it are losing money, we need to consider that their management is appointed by the Communist Party, which wants to perform well in economic terms, i.e. increase productivity. But unlike under capitalism, profitability is not their only or even main concern. In fact, in many cases, the priority is the maintenance of SOEs as a stable source of employment and income for workers. SOE managers are remunerated not for economic performance, but for obediently carrying out party decisions. Beijing has regularly instructed SOE managers not to make workers redundant, even if their companies were running at a loss. Fearing the social instability that strike waves caused during the privatization of collectivized property and resulting unemployment, particularly in the mid and late 1990s, the CCP instead uses SOEs to provide social security for their workers now. Initial attempts to make the state sector profitable are often directly countered by forcing those that are doing well to swallow employees of unviable SOEs and employ them even if there is nothing for them to do. Although state-owned enterprises often no longer provide the cradle-to-grave welfare system, the iron rice bowl that existed under Mao, many of them still provide services that a private company would not, such as nurseries, housing for the workers, schools for children, and canteens with free meals. Pay and conditions in jobs in this sector tend to be better than the private sector. SOEs do not exist as separate entities from the state by virtue of receiving advantages from state-owned banks, but they are also linked to one another by means of state planning. Chris Bramall, professor at the University of Sheffield here in Britain, noted that despite the formal renaming of the State Planning Commission during the reform period, the CCP continues to carry out economic planning, but by indicative means of setting rules and adjusting macroeconomic development, by checking the multiple economic players through direct and indirect interference in their business decisions and regulation, which achieves the close alignment of China's economic development with the predefined 5-year plans that the CCP issues. A 2011 report by the US-China Economic and Security Commission stressed the role that SOEs play in the 5-year plans. It states, quote unquote, it does not matter that the 12th 5-year plan does not mention SOEs explicitly with regards to key development projects and industry goals. The SOEs are already dominant in most of the industries which are mentioned in the plan. And in cases where projects require large capital expenditures, only SOEs are in a position to make such investments. Thus, although China is comfortable with a mixed economy that incorporates private enterprises and foreign investments, it continues to rely on SOEs to carry out what it deems to be the most important projects. And although China is comfortable with the market allocating resources to improve enterprise decision-making, it does not trust the market to determine China's industrial structure. It is noteworthy that state planning does not only benefit CCP bureaucrats, but also the broader population. Chinese workers have received significant wage increases, not just because of strike action, but also because of the state investment programs the CCP launched in response to the global capitalist crises, which caused job losses due to mass bankruptcies of the private capitalists. These investment programs have permitted former private sector workers to find new jobs in the state sector. It is indisputable that the CCP has lifted over 800 million people out of abject poverty, which is not to deny that many do not exactly enjoy a fancy lifestyle. Beijing's poverty alleviation program is nonetheless impressive, particularly when considering that the ruling classes in the imperialist world have imposed one austerity program after the next over the last decades, leading to ever-increasing levels of poverty in these much wealthier countries. On top of this, between 2007 and 2017, China's state investment program managed to grow the economy by more than 80%, whereas growth rates of the imperialist countries were stuck in the lower single digits. Neoliberals like to ascribe this success exclusively to China's private capital. Deng's reforms resulted in the ascendance of a private sector which constituted itself out of small-scale peasant businesses which were permitted to sell most of their produce in the market, as well as privatized SOEs and township and village enterprises. Working conditions in most private companies are reminiscent of those in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, with extremely long working hours, few breaks, and relatively poor pay. But despite their far greater profitability when compared to the state sector, private enterprises do not dominate the Chinese economy. China's domestic capitalist businesses are, with a few noteworthy exceptions, far smaller in size than state-owned enterprises, though there are more of them in terms of absolute numbers. Until the mid-2010s, they expanded dramatically, but in more recent years, the CCP has increasingly imposed its authority over the business decisions of capitalist companies, in part by the mandatory introduction of party committees at board level. To survive as a capitalist in China, you have to curry favor with the party, which can be very costly. The capitalist sector's weakness originates from the state's systematic discrimination when it comes to accessing various production factors, not least loans to expand production. Economist Nicholas Lardy observed that since 2016, China's big four state-owned banks have been systematically depriving private businesses of loans and have funded less and sometimes non-profitable state-owned enterprises instead. At the same time, the CCP has clamped down on the shadow banking sector, the go-to source for financing for domestic capitalists, leading to a decline in private investment.
10 minutes.
CEOs who try to obtain funding from illegal sources can find themselves behind bars quite easily, like the richest businessman of 2008, Huang Guangyu, who ended up in prison for being involved in a bribery case following having a bank loan denied. It is because of events like this that the chairman of the computer giant Lenovo stated that Chinese entrepreneurs are a vulnerable class who, when faced with improper action of the state, can do nothing other than trying to minimize their losses. The current global capitalist crisis has further dented private capital in China. A study by Tsinghua University published in March this year suggested that if Beijing had to continue the lockdown they had implemented at the time until June, 85% of all private businesses would go bankrupt. The CCP's treatment of private capital demonstrates how political decision-making trumps the law of value in China. In 2003, for the first time in its history, the CCP admitted capitalists to join the party. Many of those who are party members are previous SOE managers who already were party members and who managed to privatize the enterprises to their own benefit. Yet there has been no rush for capitalists to join the CCP. Political scientist Min-Shen Pai observed that this is because, as a capitalist, you are dependent on a positive relationship with the CCP. Leaving it when you are already a member could be interpreted as a lack of loyalty, which can have serious repercussions for your business and yourself. That's why only 6% of party members are actual capitalists, whereas 44% of the party's members are blue-collar workers and small peasants. The dominance of the pro-market faction within the CCP, which was hoping to ultimately cash in on capitalist counter-revolution, similarly to some Russian CP bureaucrats under Yeltsin, has evaporated for now. This is not to say that some of them and their family members have managed to turn themselves into billionaires in the meantime. There are two reasons for the weakness of the pro-capitalist wing. The first relates to the two global capitalist crises in 2008 and in this year, in which the wonders of the market showed their ugly face and again hit the export-oriented private sector and China particularly hard. It was up to the state sector to clean up the mess the invisible hand of the market had created, which the CCP did by means of huge state investment programs, resulting in the creation of millions of new jobs in the construction and digital industries. The second reason behind the current weakness of the pro-capitalist wing relates to waves of workers' actions which hit the private sector disproportionately hard. The social unrest of China's mighty proletariat in response to the sweatshop conditions and privatizations has frightened Beijing's bureaucrats. In an acknowledgement that the CCP's pseudo-socialist rhetoric was often exposed by a reality of increased income disparities that spurred social unrest and growing popular distrust of the CCP, Xi Jinping started to combat the erosion of the party's authority, or at least try to. In a meeting in 2013, he expressed concerns that If the CCP continued with its excesses of publicly displayed self-enrichment, which were a sign of moral decline, and the lack of communism, as in Stalinism, within the ranks of the CCP, the party would meet the fate of Gorbachev, the Russian Communist Party's general secretary, who led the party into the stormy events of capitalist counter-revolution in 1991. In an attempt to counter such a prospect, Xi launched an anti-corruption campaign clouded in old Maoist verbiage of going after the tigers and flies, which has resulted in the prosecution of multiple CCP cadre. Those affected are not just factional opponents of Xi, but extend to such a large group of CCP members that observers compared to Mao's anti-rightist campaign. The campaign also targets private capitalists who have drawn the wrath of the broader population or the party. This campaign, which seeks to legitimize itself in terms of equating private wealth with corruption, is fundamentally incompatible with stable property rights, which exists only on paper. It goes without saying that this campaign obviously can't do anything about fighting corruption in a real way. However, it does not signify a complete end of the CCP's flirtation with private capital, domestic or foreign. Rather than fighting for a program of world socialist revolution, which aims to obtain technology not by the risky cooperation with imperialism under the banners of peaceful coexistence and socialism in one country, but by stimulating social revolutions in the capitalist and particularly the imperialist world, the CCP is hoping that it can somehow muddle through the threats of imperialism, which imperialism is increasingly posing to its rule. Should the imperialist saber-rattling result in a hot conflict, revolutionaries would side militarily with China against the imperialists' attempt to turn China once again into a huge colony. A capitalist counter-revolution would cause a humanitarian disaster comparable to that which ravaged through the former Soviet Union after 91, but on a far larger scale. The development of the active rule by a political conscious working class, along with extending the revolution internationally, are the two most essential factors in progressing towards the creation of a genuinely socialist society. The exercise of a political monopoly by the nationalist CCP bureaucracy constitutes an obstacle to socialist development, because just as political decision-making by working people is excluded, so too is the right to freely discuss and debate ideas and organize politically. The CCP has been relatively skillful to date in balancing the interests of the working class and the pressures of global capitalism, but in the long run, the bureaucracy's nationalist horizon, which dictates a perspective of long-term strategic coexistence with imperialism, as well as its determination to crush any and all independent political expressions by the working class outside the control of the party, must pose a threat to the survival of the collectivized economy. The only way to defend and extend the gains of the 1949 revolution is the establishment of a world revolutionary party armed with a perspective of permanent revolution. The Bolshevik tendency fights to build such a party whose program starts with the defense of the remaining state economy against internal and external capitalist counter-revolution, but aims to overthrow CCP rule by a political proletarian revolution and replaces it with a system of workers' councils. Elements of this were put into practice during the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989, in which workers fought to defend state property against privatization, but with the aim of establishing democratic workers' rule in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpe. I think it was a good presentation. So just to explain the format again, we'll now have discussion. You can raise your hand as Robert has, and I'll be taking him as the first panelist to speak. Or you can indicate in the chat, and I have a question from Elliot, which I will read out after Robert has spoken. So if you're interested in speaking, oh, that's not good. Sorry, Zoom just gave me an error. There he is. Okay, so we will be having 5 minutes for this first round. You don't have to speak for 5 minutes, obviously. If you've just got a question, you can go speak for shorter. But we want to have a good discussion, and 5 minutes is probably really the minimum amount of time for having a discussion, which we balance it up against trying to get the maximum number of speakers. So as people saw, the other thing is when you've got 1 minute to go, I'll put up the 1 minute sign. So watch out for me, just so you've got an idea that your time's running out. So okay, Rob, I think you should be able to start now.
Hi, I'm Robert, a supporter of the International Bolshevik Tendency. I'd like to thank the speaker and the Bolshevik Tendency for organising this meeting. It's a paradox that the vast majority of pro-capitalist commentators correctly state that China is not capitalist, and I think the entire Chinese bourgeoisie would agree with them, and therefore call for capitalist restoration via various means. But the vast majority of the pseudo-Trotskyist left in imperialist countries, such as the IMT, the SEP, the Socialist Party in England and Wales, and the UK SWP, and all their various splits and affiliates and so on, along with various reformists and anarchists, claim without a coherent argument that China is capitalist and that they therefore won't defend its conquest of the working class. It's mainly those organisations in the Spartacist tradition, the BT, the IBT, and so on, who have the correct revolutionary position that China is not capitalist and that it must be defended from internal and external forces of capitalist restoration, and that the CCP bureaucracy must be overthrown through political revolution. So this leads me to pose a few questions whose answers might help us as revolutionaries convince the rest of the working class of our arguments. So what's the purpose of Chinese foreign direct investment across things like profit making, political influence, market expansion, round tripping, and so on? How does this vary geographically? Like, you know, the One Belt, One Road initiative compared to Africa or South America? And really, is there any extraction of super profits through exploitation of cheaper labor, more accessible raw materials, and lower costs of transport through the supply chain? And where is this coming from? Like state institutions like sovereign wealth funds and SOEs and banks, private mutual funds, pension funds, corporations, etc. I mean, that would take a lot of untangling, and that's not even going into all the numerous public-private hybrids. But I think it's kind of useful. Yeah, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin said, but he did not anticipate degenerated or deformed worker states, and other degenerated and deformed worker states haven't had this level of kind of foreign direct investment and expansion into markets in other countries, like non-imperialist countries and kind of the colonies and neo-colonies of imperialist countries. So, you know, is there a benefit within China to the bourgeoisie or even to like the states of generating super profits? Or are they, and so do we perhaps need a new economic category that's like not capitalist imperialism, but is still very worrying to revolutionaries? Or is this Chinese FDI and market expansion predominantly generating average or below average profits or even loss making, and largely benefiting China and its population as a whole, albeit with the increasing levels of disparity between rich and poor, and serving political and defensive purposes, providing China with raw materials, acting as a conduit for the transfer of technology, and so on. There is an uneasy syncretism of the law of primitive socialist accumulation and the law of value, but at the end of the day, the Chinese state defends the former and keeps a tight rein on the latter, at least for the moment. The bureaucracy seeks temporary alliances with imperialists when it suits them, but this is playing with fire, and all these contradictions, and ultimately the contradiction of the working class in China being both a ruling and an oppressed class, can only be resolved by either capitalist restoration through counter-revolution or the birth of genuine socialism through a political revolution. We fight with the Bolshevik tendency for the latter. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, I've got a question from Elliot now, and then I have got Ian, Dara, and Alazar. So I'll just read the question from Elliot. He asks, what percentage of the Politburo of the CCP are now millionaires? Now, obviously, Hape will come back to questions at the end, but people should feel to comment on those questions and answer them if they've got an answer to them. So just promoting Ian. If you can unmute yourself, Ian, you should have got a prompt.
Yeah, I've got it. Let me just start this. Right, hi.
Okay.
Hi.
There you go.
Okay, hi, I'm Ian from the LCFI, Liaison Committee for the Fourth International and Trotsky's faction in Britain. I just got make a few points really about this. I mean, I read the rather large article on China that was produced a couple of weeks ago or so. And I've obviously listened to the presentation from Hape tonight. I mean, I disagree with this. I think it does actually deny things that have happened over the last couple of decades or more, really, in China. You know, and it seems to make light of some of these major changes that have happened. You know, I mean, you're talking about a deformed worker state, which is a country that's had a social revolution, and some of the key aspects of any worker state are things like a state monopoly of foreign trade, a statified economy, and the bourgeoisie itself. The bourgeoisie is suppressed, even if it's allowed to. If some vestige of the bourgeoisie is allowed to exist, it's most definitively not the ruling class and has, and basically does not have any power, and it can be expropriated at any time. And the whole purpose of a worker state, even a deformed worker state, has always basically been to suppress capitalism and to make sure that capitalism does not operate as the decisive principle of the economy. That was true in China for many decades, from 1949 until the early 90s, or even arguably earlier the process began, but it did actually culminate in the early 90s, at more or less the same time as it culminated in other parts of the former Soviet bloc. But it happened in a different way, I mean, you look at China today. You've had no state monopoly of foreign trade for decades. You have stock markets in several major cities, and I'm sure the stock markets are different. They trade some government securities as well as private securities as different proportions because it's a more statified economy. But nevertheless, the whole point of a stock market is to trade private property in the means of production, or to trade investments, private investments or whatever. And they are a major part of the Chinese economy. They're classic organs of capitalism. And that's a huge difference from the Soviet Union under Stalinism and from China under Maoism. There are more billionaires in China than in the United States. That's slightly misleading because China is 4 times the size of the United States in terms of population. But nevertheless, it's a lot. It's a sizable chunk of capitalism, sizable chunk of capital. The article says the bourgeoisie is precarious. I think its position is precarious. I mean, that is a somewhat subjective evaluation. But as I said, under any kind of worker state, the bourgeoisie its position is not merely precarious, it's decisively subordinate if it's tolerated at all. I mean, China is a hybrid bourgeois layer that's interpenetrated with the state bureaucracy, and that's part of its historical origin. I think that what happened in China is they saw the economic disaster of Russia and unregulated counter-revolution, right? Decided to regulate it from above, you know. That's what happened in China. That's what the bureaucracy did. Its version of capitalist restoration was highly regulated and decided to avoid subordination to imperialism and neoliberalism, an alternative model of capitalist restoration. But that's what it's all about, right? Yeah. I'm running out of time, but there's a couple of points I'd like to make. One is about Bukharinism, right? Trotsky advocated a bloc with Stalin against Bukharin because he considered that Bukharin's far more limited program of marketization and peasants enrich yourself was a mortal danger to the worker state. If you say that China today, which is far, far more advanced in that sense, is still a worker state, then doesn't it raise the question of whether Trotsky was even right to do that? Does it also not raise the question of whether Stalin was right to panic in an empirical way, to panic and break with Bukharin and basically crush Bukharin's faction in a brutal manner as part of the forced collectivization? Wasn't that an exaggerated panic about the prospects of capitalist restoration? There was a certain block between Trotsky and between the left opposition and the Stalinist regime to crush Bukharin's right opposition, you know. And does not the opposition on China actually raise the question of whether that was a mistake or not? That's all. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Tara is the next speaker, followed by Alazar, Jason, and Josh.
Thanks, Alan. My name's Dara. I'm a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency in London, and I wanted to talk about the Chinese state's recent record with regards to human rights. For example, the Hong Kong protests, which were launched by the Civil Human Rights Front, a last shot including organizations like the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor and the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, both of which have long histories of funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, a US agency that Alex Rubinstein aptly described as a CIA soft power cutout that has played a critical role in innumerable US regime change operations. And so, of course, the attitude of revolutionaries to this movement must begin by recognizing the necessity to militarily defend the Chinese deformed workers' state and the collectivized property rights, the collectivized property system upon which it's based. So this requires the suppression of the pro-imperialist leadership of the protests and their hardcore followers, who compose an ever-increasing proportion of the demonstrations as participation dwindles. It's obviously necessary that in order to stop this threat, all these NGOs and other operations that have been operating as willing conduits for the National Endowment for Democracy and similar agencies of counter-revolution, because while we have no political confidence in the Beijing bureaucrats, we would certainly militarily side with them in any confrontation with the counter-revolutionaries of the CHRF. And I'd also like to talk about the Uyghur question, specifically the marginalized community of Turkic descent from China's northwest province of Xinjiang. So we've heard recently the Western media repeating the claim that 1 to 1.5 million Uyghurs and other minority groups have been sent to concentration camps over the past couple of years. However, such claims originate from just two very right-wing sources and appear to be based on extrapolations from verbal accounts of just 8 Uyghurs. In reality, the numbers detained are likely to be far fewer. Nevertheless, the existence of such camps is not disputed by the Chinese bureaucracy, which refers to them as vocational educational and training centers. Moreover, Uyghurs have become a noticeable part of the constellation of globally active jihadist terror groups. And there have been numerous reports by political think tanks which keep tabs on globally active jihadist terror groups. And Uyghur jihadists first came to the world's attention when the US and its allies invaded Afghanistan in 2001. While continuing their cooperation with the Taliban under the banner of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, Uyghur jihadists have now spread to Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Their members are part of the Turkestan Islamic Party fighting with Al-Qaeda in Syria, but other Uyghurs have joined IS in Syria and Iraq, and still others have joined local terror groups in Indonesia. However, Uyghurs are currently still under examined as active participants in jihadist organizations. Publications about Uyghurs have been piecemeal, focusing on their struggles against the Chinese government or narrowly describing the specific groups in which Uyghurs have been participants. So while it's clear that the US propaganda machine has been hard at work, it's also clear that the Chinese Stalinist bureaucracy is not handling these situations with kid gloves. And while as revolutionaries, we have no political confidence in the bureaucrats or support for the bureaucracy, but we would block with them militarily against forces which are explicitly pro-capitalist restoration, especially having seen the results of capitalist restoration in the Eastern Europe in the 90s. Thank you. Finished.
Thank you, Dara. Next, I've got Alazar. I'll just unmute you. And on the speakers list after Alazar are Jason and Josh. Alazar, you should be getting a prompt to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. For those of us influenced by the Spartacus League's pamphlet on the counter-revolutionary policies of the Maoists and then continue on politically, we know that ultimately politics follows economics. So here's my questions and perhaps some comments. The ratio of nationalized property to private property in economic weight, not numbers of enterprise. And has there been a return, which is I've heard from some neo-Stalinists, of privatized industry back into national control? And then it seems to me, an evolutionary observation of China's history, that there's been a retrenchment of the open counter-revolutionary behavior, like working with UNITA in Angola and hideous things. But Stalinists have always done hideous counter-revolutionary. Not only did they have a Nazi-Soviet pact, but Molotov went to Berlin and shook hands with Heinrich Himmler, Hitler held his arm. I have photos of all that. So there's the bottom of what Stalinism can do to appease imperialism. For example, the revolution in Cuba of 1933 was betrayed to seek a recognition by the United States by a number of observers. There's even an early SWP article on it, but actually the best article is by the strange Weisbordites. So my question is, now, despite the fact that China helped impose sanctions on North Korea and dickers around with imperialism, the forces that originally U.S. imperialism used to divide China and their still existing Soviet Union seem to be changing, in that the U.S. is trying to militarily encircle both Russia and China. And it seems to be that there might be amending offenses between the two states, despite the difference of their socioeconomic characterization. So I'm still stuck with believing that China is a seriously deformed worker state, as I do China, despite the fact that progressive labor type revisionists call it a fascist state. They may even call China a fascist state. So instead of being emotional about this, I'm interested in what has been the trajectory of the Chinese bureaucracy in facing U.S. imperialism, both politically and economically, and can we still justify calling it a deformed worker state, which I do still feel it's. So that's basically the question. How do you analyze the economic and social integration relationships that are going on in the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Elazar. Next is Jason, but before Jason speaks, people might note in the chat that Max Irwin, before he left, put in a long comment critical of the way we were presenting the question. I'm not implying that it was capitalist state, because there was a lot of capitalism there and the working class working power. And Judith has just posed a question for the panel. Max Irwin differs with the traditional Trotskyist view, and for him the USSR would not be a workers' state. You will have to read the chat. You'll have to scroll up to look at what Max wrote. I can't think there is any way to resolve this deeper question. Can the panel? It is easy enough to point out the gains for all in China. It's a lot harder to explain the two Koreas through this prism. I've got another question after that, but I'll take Jason now.
Thanks, Alan. In State and Revolution, Lenin salvages from Kautskyite distortions Marx's conception of the state. The reality is that the state, by which I mean the government, police, judicial apparatus, rests on and supports the class nature of society. It exists to defend the rule of the class that rules society. Marx's insight in the Civil War in France is that the Paris Commune is the dictatorship of the proletariat in embryonic form. Now, the Commune does not manage to really set up a collectivized economy. It doesn't manage to expropriate much. Marx catalogs a number of these failings and could have cataloged more if he wasn't also writing a eulogy. What we embrace in the Commune is the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, at least in Paris for a brief moment, as the rule is transferred out of the hands of the ruling class and the workers run the city. This was the inspiration for generations of socialists. Likewise, not much really happens to the Russian economy on November 7th or November 8th of 1917. The October Revolution opens up the ability to expropriate capitalist enterprise by smashing the bourgeois state. Arguments based purely on the number of state-owned enterprises are fundamentally divorced from the actual thinking of Marx and Trotsky. It isn't about percentages, it's about who controls the state and what class and property form the state rests upon. Nevertheless, we saw the confusion in reverse when the left was disoriented by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The BT traced the disintegration of the USSR to the moment of the failed August coup, when the military backed Yeltsin against the Stalinist hardliners represented Yanayev in what was certainly an anemic but nonetheless real last-ditch effort to put the brakes on capitalist restoration. I say all this to point out that Mao's peasant-based army did smash the Chinese capitalists. It collectivized property in the name of the workers, albeit in a manner that was deformed from birth, and admittedly with considerably less input and participation from the workers than had occurred in the Soviet Union. And the government established in 1948, 1949, never been smashed or overturned. What we see instead is a sort of new economic policy, NEP, on steroids, with inevitably bad conditions for workers in the free enterprise zones. The USSR, of course, needed an NEP policy for primitive socialist accumulation, as Happy pointed out, for purposes to erect the technological and economic scaffold for socialist construction. Other worker states, not just China, but also Vietnam, Cuba, etc., have been forced to follow the same course. Naturally, as long as there's this link to the world market and outside money flowing in, there is a great danger of capitalist restoration. However, a moralistic argument, an argument that boils down to horrific conditions in iPad factories, etc., substitutes philosophical idealism for Marxism. It is not a Marxist argument to reduce it to a worker state is only a worker state if it is good for all workers. Of course, things other than the NEP were also bad for workers. The conditions of industrial development in the USSR under the 5-year plans with forced collectivization, the backyard steel furnaces weren't good for workers either, and they were replete with Stalinist stupidities. But it doesn't mean the USSR or China weren't worker states just because these policies affected a considerable strata of workers in a way that caused suffering. The bottom line is, despite the horrific distortions, the subordination of private capital to a nominally, at least in name administered by the working class, is a concrete advance for humanity. And it's something that we as socialists should defend, albeit while raising criticism of the Stalinist bureaucracy. The Iron Rice Bowl, Cuba's healthcare system, these are all things that were achieved by the collectivization of property that are not available even some of the imperialist countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Josh is next, and I don't have any speakers after him. But before Josh, I've got another question, which I'll just read out. This is from Robert McKee. Can China realistically ever catch up in per capita income with imperialist economies at current growth rates? So, Josh, can I ask you to unmute?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Go.
Okay, thanks, Alan. So I'm Josh, and like Robert, I'm a supporter of the International Bolshevik Tendency, the IBT. Now, I realize that's probably confusing to many of you, but we are a different group. The group from which the BT split 2 years ago and in their wisdom adopted a virtually identical name. I'll get to that in a moment. But it's not quite right when Jason says, therefore, that the BT analyzed the Soviet counter-revolution and put forward a revolutionary perspective. It was the IBT. Now, that was a great detailed presentation from Hoppe, based on that very lengthy article you put out not too long ago. We agree entirely with Hoppe's analysis in the presentation of China as a deformed worker state, and with the programmatic upshot of unconditional military defense of China against imperialism and capitalist counter-revolution, for example, via Hong Kong or wherever. And of course, we agree with the perspective of proletarian political revolution. There are very few organizations that continue to defend China, and it's important that anti-Pavlovite tendencies work together. What is the BT? A group that split from us with little reason to set up a competing organization with a very similar name. That is not how Leninists operate. The BT claims to want to build a revolutionary party through a process of splits and fusions, but they could immediately double their size simply by rejoining our forces. Those who might be considering getting involved or staying involved with the BT should ask themselves how serious they are about building a group when they have been so cavalier about splitting from us. Now, those who are interested in the political issues involved can read the many documents both groups have put on our websites. We had a long-standing theoretical difference over the character of imperialist Russia, a difference that had generated no substantial concrete political difference. We do have differences over conceptualizing the world situation, but these differences are containable inside a single group. We were in a minority in the matter for a decade, and we stayed. The BT also cited a tactical difference we had over events in Turkey, a country in which we had no supporters, and a difference that would have made no practical difference on the ground anyway. If you can't be in a group with us, you have no serious perspective of building a large Leninist organization or even a slightly less tiny Leninist propaganda group. And if truly defending China and fighting for proletarian political revolution means building a Leninist vanguard party, which it does, then your presentation, as good as it was, is just empty words. Finished.
Thank you, Josh. I now have Paul, and I'll just promote him. And asking you to unmute there, Paul.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, I first would like to commend Happy on his presentation and the BT on its article. I mean, both are, I think, a very good and a very detailed analysis of what is, a very complex phenomenon. The rise of the Deng Xiaoping faction in the late 70s and the movement towards market reforms, I think, are very disorienting for many leftists, which is clear from the polemics contained in the article itself. But it does show, I think, the article that the Stalinist bureaucracy in China does conform to the the historical analysis provided by the Trotskyist movement, in that it is the middleman between international imperialism and the deformed worker state, but it's inherently entwined. Its interests are entwined with the deformed worker state, and I think that's very evident from. We can see the evolution of policy between the various leaders in the Chinese leadership, from Deng to the current leadership, and I think that a lot of the confusion is I think Ian signaled I think the things that people do get, I guess, distracted by. He mentioned that, for example, there's a stock market in Shanghai, therefore it must be a capitalist country. I mean, I know that Ian, and I know for myself, don't have $100 million to invest, but if you did have $100 million to invest, I can guarantee you one place you can't put it is the Shanghai Stock Exchange. It is, you would run into all kinds of capital controls. You wouldn't be able to own any of the companies that are listed there by buying up stock, and it simply does not have the same function in China as it does in Western countries. I mean, the article addresses that, but I think that people need to understand that the form does, the function does matter more than the form, and you have to ask yourself fundamentally, who dictates labor policy, who dictates economic policy, who dictates foreign policy in China? Is it Jack Ma, like ostensibly, and he's like one of the big guys of the ruling class, ostensibly, if it was a capitalist country. But the reality is that he doesn't have much of a role in dictating policy, which is evident if you look at, for example, the Chinese leadership's foray into the international field in terms of this the one road policy of expanding into Eurasia with infrastructure projects. These are not driven by dictates of the law of value. They're driven by the dictates of securing precious resources for the Chinese economy, and also for geostrategic reasons. I mean, that's abundantly clear when people look at the role of the program. It's not to maximize profit for an imaginary, imaginary Chinese ruling class, but to further the interests of the Chinese state. And I think that that's evident, especially, I mean, in his discussion on, how far did Bukharin go before Stalin crack down on him. I mean, I think we just saw evidence of that quite recently with Wu Xiaohui and the Anbang Insurance Group. I mean, this is a guy that clearly was acting, you know, on his own and kind of doing what he was doing. And you know, when Chinese government decided they had enough of what he was attempting to do with that company, he simply disappeared and ended up in jail. So we can say that the ruling class, I mean, the capitalists have influence in China, but I think the reality is that we're looking at a different kind of society. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Robert had indicated that he wanted to speak, but as I mentioned at this, and I've got someone in the background there, okay, that he wanted to speak, but I'll take people who haven't spoken before I take you again, Robert. So first of all, I've got Christoph, and then I've got Roxy, and then I've got Catherine. So Christoph, I'll just ask you to unmute.
Yes, hello. I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese working class and how it relates to its position within a deformed worker state. Now, as we know, the Chinese working class is numerous in numbers and over the last years has also asserted itself through strikes more actively than in many years before. It is in a peculiar position that it has to both struggle for its own interests as a class, but also it finds itself within a deformed worker state, supposedly a state that is run for its benefits, but clearly currently not run by them. And of course, in that sense, it has a similarity to the situation of the Soviet Union, as other comrades have pointed out. In fact, Lenin had some very interesting remarks on that very situation exactly 100 years ago, actually. He addressed the 8th Soviet Congress in 1920, and during the discussions on the trade unions, he had the following to say: "Our present state is such that the organized proletariat must defend itself, and we must utilize these workers' organizations for the defense of the workers against their state and for the defense of the state by the workers." What Lenin was speaking about was twofold. The first is, of course, his recognition of, as early as 1920, the rise of a bureaucracy and the fact that the working class, through its trade unions, needs to defend itself, assert itself against bureaucratic excesses. And the second part that he emphasized is, of course, that the very same workers need to defend the state, the gains, the Soviet state against counter-revolution. Now in China, I think the political tasks are very similar, although they might take different organizational forms. The working class does need to defend itself against the state. Now, that might take the form of strikes, it might take the form of political protests. And the forms might vary in the sense that it might not happen through the official trade union federation, since it is to a large extent controlled by the Stalinists, although I would note not completely. It is also somewhat sensitive to pressure from below, as trade union organizations across the world tend to be. Now, we also know that there are independent, autonomous trade union organizations in China, those who sprang up because of the very fact that the trade union movement was controlled or is controlled by the bureaucracy. So it might come through official trade union struggles or through the autonomous workers' movements in China that the working class defends itself against the bureaucracy. But I think it is clear that the two options that they have of defense against the bureaucracy and defense of the state are both very important. And if the working class is not successful in defending the state and in overthrowing the bureaucracy, the prospects for China are very dire. So I think we know the fate of the Soviet Union, other Eastern European states, and we can only hope that the Chinese working class will take the path of finally overthrowing the bureaucracy and establishing a genuine worker state in China. Finished.
Thank you, Christoph. Okay, I've got Roxy, then Roxy followed by Catherine, and then it'll be Robert, unless someone who hasn't already spoken indicates they want to speak, in which case I'll take them ahead of Robert. Roxy?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Roxanne. I'm also a member of the Bolshevik Tendency. Just very quickly on Josh's point about the IBT-BT split. I find it remarkable that Josh would refer to this as having happened with little reason, and for it to have been a cavalier decision after a decade of discussion. It's our view that the nature of imperialism, and specifically whether or not to defend Russia, for example, in a hot war or not, is a red line issue and a matter of life and death. For example, whether you would defend it as a semi-colonial country or whether you would be dual defeatist in an inter-imperialist war. So yes, that's a real concrete difference in the real world, informed by your theoretical approach. So the problem is twofold there. So to diminish this concrete difference is dishonest. Just as a group's concrete analysis of China is informed by one's theoretical approach, and also a life and death issue for the Chinese proletariat and the world proletariat, which is why it's so important that we get this one right as well. So I wanted to talk a bit about foreign capital, foreign direct investment in China. The first speaker, Robert, brought this up and posed some good questions about the role of it in the country. So, for example, do super profits and super exploitation still happen, or is, are these companies loss making? Is it more about raw materials and technology? So I just wanted to address that a little bit, because when a lot of left groups, as others have pointed to, addressed the existence of capital in China, it's quite impressionistic. If capital exists, then capitalism must exist. As Harper mentioned in his presentation, though, foreign direct investment only constitutes about 1% of its GDP at the moment. And, that's half of what it was 10 years before and about a fifth of what it was 20, 25 years ago. So there's a clear trend there. So I think it's very important to look at the different stages that China has had to go through over the decades, but also how and why that foreign direct investment operates. That's the crux of the question. And I guess the main way to answer that is essentially for modernization and to avoid isolation in a world imperialist order, not to maximize profit of a minority. This is a knock-on effect and is a motivation of some individuals, but it's not what drives the whole economy in a kind of macro picture. It's really essential, has been so essential for China to, to gather that kind of innovation and technological advancement in order to survive in the world and to build its economy, just as the Soviet Union did in the 1920s. And Jason also gave some good examples of how the Soviet Union dealt with its contradictions as part of its degenerated worker state. And in this current example of our deformed worker state, China, what we have to do is constantly try and hold the contradiction. And it's not an easy argument to make. It's not an easy situation to analyze. So, for example, Ian seemed to be arguing that that worker states have always had a zero tolerance for the bourgeoisie, which is just not the case. It never has been, and it isn't the case in China. And one of the problems is that some of that super exploitation, which has generally been in the low-tech manufacturing, has looked very much like pure capitalism from the outside. But even that now It's been utilized for its purposes of modernizing China, and now that's been outsourced to places like Indonesia and Vietnam, Bangladesh, parts of Africa, partly because of working class fight back, but also because the living conditions and the advanced technology have allowed the CCP to do that, now that they have what they need. And throughout time, it's been different tactics, but it's always been with the same goal, which is to restrict imperialist investors, whether it be to say through location, you can only go to the special economic zones, or more recently, you can only be in strategic sectors. The capitalists don't call the shots. It's the CCP who dictate how that foreign investment is used, whether it's through joint ventures with Chinese partners and imperialist partners. So I'll have to leave it there, but you essentially now in Xi Jinping's period, we see now that they've got more time and agency to play with now that they've managed to modernize in the way they have.
Thank you. Okay, that's actually Tom. Okay, Tom, when you're ready.
Okay. This is a very important question, obviously. China is playing an increasingly important role in the world. And I thought Rob from the IBT made a very good point to lead off with, and that is that it's phenomenal that so much of the left remains fixated on the idea that because China is ostensibly has stock markets, which actually don't have any control and any influence, as we outlined in our article, because China has many billionaires and many, many millionaires, a fair chunk of the Chinese party, something like 5% are millionaires, and has other superficially capitalist attributes that we should evaluate China as a society that's essentially similar to Germany, the United States, or an advanced capitalist society, or at least Brazil, perhaps. In fact, nothing fundamental has changed in China. And that's the point of Hoppe's presentation. I think that's the point of the article that we wrote. It's not to say that something fundamental might not change in the future, or it could have changed in the last few decades. Superficially, there appeared to be a great number of changes. And many groups, including the Spartacus League, which I guess hardly exists anymore, but was an important group for many of us for quite a while, were disoriented by the developments in China. The Spartacus group at one point said that China, if China was to join the WTO, which it had applied for in about, I think it was about 1991, they made the application, they were allowed in 2001. Spartacus League said that would signify that China had become capitalist. Well, China did join the WTO, and the Spartacus League, to its credit, corrected itself and said, no, actually, it didn't signify anything important. Trotsky's 3 questions that he posed to James Burnham during the fight in the SWP, I think are very important ones in evaluating a worker state and its historical development. He said, first, what is the origin of this state? And the origin of the Soviet Union, of course, was the Russian Revolution. The origin of the Chinese deformed worker state was the 1949 revolution, which destroyed the connection of the imperialists and destroyed the indigenous bourgeoisie and created a state which was modeled essentially on the Soviet degenerated worker state ruled by the Communist Party. What changes have there been since that revolution was Trotsky's second question. And there have been many changes, and that's largely what we're discussing today. But it's our assertion, and I believe that it is backed by a careful empirical investigation, that none of the fundamentals have changed, that the Communist Party of China remains in control, that there remains a centralized economy at its core, and that the foreign monopoly of trade still exists, that the capitalists, for instance, international bankers cannot invest in China. They can't issue loans to Chinese companies. They can't buy up Chinese companies. They can't set up their own companies in China, except with the express permission of the Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party, which has been very careful to carefully limit and restrict the kinds of investments that can be made, the kinds of companies that can be set up, and the conditions under which they can operate. And the Chinese, in 1991, Daddy Bush, we had this in the article, George W. Bush's father, Bush 1, was quite explicit about what was going to go on. He said that we were going to take advantage of China opening up to the world market. Thank you, Alan, got that. And that we will inevitably see the erosion of the deformed worker state. And as capitalist penetration increases, we will end up replaying what was about to go on in the Soviet Union. That, in fact, hasn't happened. The American bourgeoisie has drawn the conclusion that they were outplayed by the Stalinist bureaucracy. And the situation we've got today reflects that. China's technology has benefited a great deal. And Robert, the other Robert asked a question about, can China can China reach the levels of per capita income currently enjoyed by the more dominant Western powers? It's not clear to me why they can't. China's R&D exceeds that of any other country in the world. China's developing a lot of new technologies. The problem with China is that the Stalinist ruling caste is inherently unstable, and for reasons that Hoppe outlined rather clearly, needs to be removed so that the worker state can be run by workers. That's the only way that in the long term a worker state is viable.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, as we had no one else indicating they want to speak, we'll have Robert back for the second time.
Alan, don't we, just as a thing of order, wouldn't the speaker normally have a summary before speakers then that spoke already then can come back on the list?
We don't tend to do that in public meetings, and we're getting close to the end anyway.
Okay.
Sorry, Hoppe. Rob.
Hi, yeah. So I'm in complete agreement with Josh regarding the BT. And I'd like to thank the other contributors for responding to some of my questions. And in response to Ian, you know, just because there's elements of capitalism, even like large elements of capitalism, does not make China capitalist any more than like nationalization of banks in various South American countries in the 70s, or the prevalence of state ownership in heavy industry in Belarus or anything else make those any kind of socialist or planned economies. Like pseudo-Trotskyists and OROs and the broader left refuse to admit that China is not capitalist, because then they would have to say what it is, and they don't have any coherent, complete analysis of that. And they would have to justify not defending the gains of the 1949 revolution, which they don't want to do either because, you know, they're infected with bourgeois ideology. They're afraid of, you know, they're in fear of capitalist state forces. They don't want to look unpopular. They want to pander to the soft left and liberal Democrats and so on. So, you know, all of this is, you know, it's a misunderstanding and a bad analysis, but it's one that's actually fed by other reasons. And, you know, people who deny that China is not capitalist don't want to understand that it's not capitalist. And revolutionaries must split the advanced elements of the working class from these reformists and centrists and unite in a vanguard party. And as Josh said, you know, all those anti-Pablo-like forces should be in the same organization. Or differences are, you know, very little, and they can be discussed and thrashed out and agreed upon. And this kind of, you know, fragmentation is not of benefit to any of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So I have Ian who, oh no, actually, for Ian, I'll take Barbara because she hasn't spoken yet.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ready to go.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm Barbara. I'm from the International Bolshevik Tendency, the IBT, as Josh and Robert. We're at a stage now, if you look at the organizations around the world that call themselves Trotskyists, that very few of them agree with us in the IBT and with the BT that China remains a deformed worker state. And I think Ian actually provided a very good illustration of some of the thinking of these people that believe, how did Ian put it, a counter-revolution regulated from above, which completely flies in the face of Trotskyism's thoughts about the state and thoughts about what a deformed and degenerated worker state is, as many other contributors have pointed out. It's very clear in China today, as Harpei's given many examples, and the article produced recently by the BT, and articles that the two organizations, the IBT and the BT, collectively produced together over many years when we were all in the same organization. So yeah, it's clear that capitalism is not, as Ian put it, a central deciding principle of the economy. And the example he used, the stock market, is actually a pretty good example of this, as others have pointed out, that it operates in a different way from a capitalist stock market. It responds to the needs of the bureaucracy in defending their position, and it does not respond to the market in the same way that as the stock market in the US and Western Europe, all around the world. So another thing we need to look at when looking at the role of China in the world is the attitude of imperialism towards China. And I think Hong Kong, that Dara and others spoke about, is a really good example of that. China is seen to pose a threat, and Hong Kong has always been seen as a kind of battering ram into China, ever since it was returned to China in 1997, and the imperialist support for the protests today, which is incredibly well documented, is an example of that. So it's important when we're talking about this, we're not just, as that early commentator argued, we're not just talking about theoretical academic points, we're talking about the tasks of the international workers' movement. And the tasks are to overthrow the bureaucracy, and not to overthrow the bureaucracy as the protest movement in Hong Kong is aiming, but to overthrow the bureaucracy in a way that will defend the remaining gains of the Chinese Revolution and extend those gains to actually put the working class of China in charge, but to make use of the planned economy and use that as the basis of getting rid of capitalism within China. And that can have a huge effect around the world. So the question that we always end our articles with, you know, the answer is to build a revolutionary party. And that is something that our tradition has always argued against the Pabloites, who in their broad terms are also the ones who are saying today that China is capitalist. And it has always been the objective of our tradition that the BT shares, that building this revolutionary party of those who are opposed to Pabloism is the primary thing. For a long time, when our comrades split from the Spartacists, we called ourselves the external tendency. We argued for unity of anti-Pabloites. It was only when absolutely forced to that they split and formed the Bolshevik tendency, which then fused with the Spartacists to form the IBT. As Josh pointed out, the IBT split is like-minded. It's on issues that we contained within as the same organization for many, many years. Roxy says that it would require taking different sides on an actual hot conflict. In fact, such a hot conflict did not take place. If Russia was such a red line for you, why did you split when you actually held a majority? This whole split is nonsense. Your organization trying to pretend that you can somehow dissolve a fusion after 28 years is a nonsense. In fact, your comrades have admitted to us that they split when they lost a vote on a tactical question in Turkey. Some of your comrades have also admitted that you don't much like the name Bolshevik tendency for the confusion that it creates in meetings like this. But if we are to go forward on issues such as China, if we are to build an international revolutionary party, then this kind of like-minded attitude towards organizational questions cannot continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, I'm going to take Ian back in. We're close to time, but as Ian, I think, is the only one arguing, apart from Max, who left, that China is capitalist, we'll let him speak, and we might go a little bit over time to let Harper get his 50-minute summary time.
Okay, just a couple of quick points. I mean, Tom says about the state monopoly of foreign trade still existing in China. I don't think that's true. I mean, the state monopoly of foreign trade means exactly what it says, that only the state can engage in foreign trade. Now, there are mixed private and state enterprises like Huawei who engage in extensive foreign trade around the world. You know, that is not the state monopoly of foreign trade. Question of who can invest in China, right? Well, it's not uncommon for relatively backward capitalist countries to restrict foreign ownership. I mean, in the Philippines, right, which is certainly not a worker state, the major public broadcaster lost its license recently for breaking ABS-CBN for breaking foreign ownership laws. You know, such things do happen elsewhere. You know, that there are restrictions on foreign investment. You know, that doesn't mean that the stock market is not capitalist. It means that there's a nationalist project, nationalist capitalist project that restricts foreign ownership, which I think is somewhat different from a state monopoly of foreign trade. Stock markets are not incompatible with capitalism, not incompatible with a deformed worker state, I should say. Well, Stalin and Mao never needed one. You know, it was completely. It's a completely different model of a deformed worker state to Stalin and Mao. It's ultra Bukharism. And I asked the question before: if Bukharism is not dangerous to a worker state, if this level of marketization and privatization can still maintain a worker state, then wasn't it scaremongering to say that Bukharin's program would restore capitalism? Because Trotsky said it, and he made a block with Stalin to prevent it. You know, I mean, we are in favour of defence of China on the same grounds that we're for defence of Russia, the same grounds that the BT are for defence of Russia against imperialism, because it's a relatively backward capitalist country that's at risk for imperialism. We also defend Iran. You know, we're opposed to regime change in Belarus orchestrated by imperialism. We're opposed to regime change in Hong Kong orchestrated by imperialism, to colour revolutions, but not on the basis that it's a worker state. There are other grounds for defending countries against imperialism other than the grounds that they're a worker state. And I think you're wrong. I think you're violating some of the tenets of Trotskyism, actually, and particularly Trotsky's block with Stalin against Bukharin becomes unnecessary if you say that China today is a worker state. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And we'll go to Harpe for a summary. And we've got just about exactly 15 minutes left to finish in our 2 hours.
Okay. Just very briefly on the IBT, on the question of unity. I mean, I just reiterate Roxy's comment, how it's dishonest claiming that you know, that the difference over Russia wasn't a real one. In 2014, when the pro-Russian rebels in Ukraine overtook the port of Sevastopol, and which got integrated in the Crimea into Russia, the IBT called for handing that over to the Ukrainian government, which was aligned with the NATO forces. Anyone siding, as Ian correctly pointed, siding with Russia as a non-imperialist country against imperialism in that conflict would have stood at the exact opposite sides of the barricades here. To say that that is a minor question, quite frankly, I don't know what to say to that. Turkey, same question. you disagree that it contains the same importance as the question of the Iranian revolution had, but that's your take. We do consider it as a more important thing, which left the BT, well, the IBT at this stage, as a group of 3 different factions, which comrades can read about in Why Things Fell Apart on our website to understand the dynamics, and that the IBT had become basically 3 separate organizations with 3 separate programs moving in different directions. But I want to go back to China. Rob asked a few interesting questions actually with regards to Chinese foreign investments. I had to look into that as well, because obviously that's something that kind of interplays with what Ian said with regards to restrictions on foreign trade. And obviously the monopoly of the state ownership, monopoly of foreign trade is in place in China to the extent that the CCP wants to have it in place. They have permitted companies to go out and carry out foreign investment, and they allow companies to come in to an extent. But again, the CCP controls who comes in, and they also control who goes out, and increasingly so actually. In 2017, they passed a law on foreign investment, which restricts both state-owned enterprises and private ones from investing willy-nilly abroad, but sort of limits them to approval by the CCP before they can go out. Certainly companies that want to make certain investments over a certain transaction value. So that's noteworthy. Are Chinese profit companies investing abroad generating super profits? Funnily enough, it's actually the smaller private companies that have that intention, certainly. There are some that are operating in Africa with that purpose in mind. But the private capital, Chinese private capital investing abroad, are primarily interested in buying into technology firms in Europe and North America, and less so in the semi-colonial world. And the state-owned sector that is actually the main driver behind Chinese foreign investment is the main driver in the semi-colonial world, and quite often actually does not make a profit. I think 33% or so of the investments that they're trying to make fail, or certainly fail to turn a profit. Others, you know, are not exactly the kind of predatory imperialist technique that we usually know from imperialism. As for the stock markets, again, the stock markets in China are not about control of the firms that are listed there. I think 80 or 85% or so of the firms listed in Chinese stock markets are state-owned enterprises. And the maximum threshold of the shareholder you can buy in those is 20%, which means even if the full market measures were applicable and the 20% ownership meant something, you wouldn't be able to control these entities at all. The state would still contain entire control over the companies. And what it means in practice is that you can throw your money at state-owned enterprises, but you cannot do it for the reasons why you'd usually buy into companies in the stock markets, certainly as a big investor, which is to increase profitability, to make business decisions around staffing, work discipline, investments, etc. That is off limits for investors in Chinese stock markets. So no, they do not operate like stock markets in the capitalist sense. Lastly, perhaps I think there is a misunderstood element amongst a lot of the self-proclaimed Trotskyist world around how state property interacts actually with the type of state we're talking about, which I pointed to in the presentation and the article, which is in a capitalist state, you usually have a bourgeoisie, and you got a few politicians that are lobbied by the multiple big enterprises to carry out certain course of policy. Yes, there are some capitalists who can lose out, quite often the petty bourgeoisie, but big capital usually wins out, and the government basically executes whatever big corporations want. In deformed worker states, it works the other way around. As I've documented, the CCP is actually the one implementing, even down into private companies, there will and influence investment decisions. And I think Elazar has raised the question around the question of the return of privatized property into state hands. There are actually increased reports of that happening. Nicholas Lardy, for example, in his book, The State Strikes Back, points to that. There are also Financial Times reports that are quoted in the article that talk about the mixed enterprise reform, which in the Western world and around 2015, when it was launched, was celebrated as sort of the next privatization push of the CCP that would now push the state sector entirely into private hands. But in reality, what's happened is a much more complex picture. One that is quite similar to the Chinese stock markets I've talked about, in which, yes, you could buy into state-owned enterprises, but again, not with a decisive, in a decisive way whereby you would have controlling stakes in these enterprises. But in turn, and due to the fact that the state, as I reported, sort of closed the tap on financing private enterprises, the private enterprises partly turned to state-owned enterprises to borrow money from state firms. And when they couldn't serve the debt on the loans that they had to repay, state-owned enterprises started to swallow up little private enterprises that couldn't repay the debt. So it's a complex process. In terms of Robert's question on whether China can catch up in terms of per capita income with the imperialist countries, I think that's a good question, but quite a speculative one. I think there's now at a third or so of the US per capita income on average, and obviously that will be distorted slightly towards your billionaires and so on. So in reality, the vast majority will probably be much or some level lower than that. But it obviously depends on how the capitalist crisis continues. It is certainly a very severe crisis. Multiple Marxist economists have shown that it's basically a continued and sort of a continuum of the 2007-2008 capitalist crisis that was caused by falling profit rates. And that crisis was somewhat deferred by massive quantitative easing programs of governments, which now seems to fully kick in, or the element of kicking the can down the road is now fully exposed to the extent that the real market corrections, i.e. capital destruction, that follows from these crises is now beginning to show its face. I mean, in Britain, we have the deepest crisis since records began, for example. It doesn't look pretty anywhere else either in the capitalist world. And China, on the other hand, is growing again. Again, not because of the private sector. It's mostly, again, state capital running big investment programs to upgrade both the infrastructure that is sort of nearing levels of imperialist countries in terms of quality, but also digital infrastructure in which they're trying to expand the 5G network, etc. So I guess it's a question of what the future will bring as well. Due to the imperialist rivalries, there's a bit of there's a recent shift in the CCP leadership. They're now thinking of preparing themselves to a lesser ability of globalization. They've obviously tagged on to the fact that the imperialist states are increasingly cautious about free trade, particularly the US under Trump. That might slightly change a bit more under Biden, although he's made noises that he will continue to use extra economic means of pressure on trade relations, such as opposing the Nord Stream 2 deal between Russia and Germany, for example. There might be a lifting potentially on easing of the sanctions on Iran, but this it seems clear that the US, in order to use all means at hand to defend its predominance in the world arena, is trying to disrupt globalization in a capitalist sense. And it's somewhat ironic that China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, is pushing for that now to an extent. But as I said, even there, they're a bit more cautious. They seem to be focusing now more on the domestic market and trying to build the economy more with the focus of domestic development. So whether that can generate per capita income of imperialist countries is a bit of a crystal ball question in that sense. Particularly, I think, as my presentation pointed out, but Tom also said, this is a very, the CCP, despite its current popularity, rests on very shaky foundations. On the one hand, they obviously don't want to give up the state sector. On the other hand, they have no program towards stabilizing that particular state. They do not want to give up capitalist influence or the use of capitalist measures within its economy entirely. So what that means in practice is that, of course, that the CCP is threatened on the one hand both by capitalist counter-revolution, both by internal forces potentially. There was a comment apparently by Jackie Ma a while back, The Guardian reported about this, in which Jackie Ma joked that he could build an alternative power base to the Communist Party, and then immediately after he stepped down from all his CEO posts, etc. Seemingly in an attempt to be targeted by the Communist Party as someone who is trying to build a power base, a capitalist power base in the country that could overthrow the Communist Party. And then we obviously have the external threat, predominantly by the US, but it's now being ramped up by the Brits as well. They've just dedicated 16 billion in additional defensive spending to rebuild the British Navy. So tensions are clearly ramping up, and yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for attending.
Yes, as Sapo says, thank you very much for coming. You might have noticed there were some links put into the chat there. You might need to scroll back up to see them. If you're interested in the different assessments of the split in the international Bolshevik tendency, and I guess the question of whether having a common understanding of the nature of imperialism is an important issue in the coming period where inter-imperialist rivalries are going to be increasing. But I'll leave that up to the participants to make their own judgment. I obviously think that is an important issue. But thank you everyone for coming. I also put the contact email address for the Bolshevik tendency in there if you've got questions about this or any other issues. And we will use your email addresses to inform you of future forums. We may or may not have another one before the end of the year, but we'll certainly be having one in the early new year if we don't have one before the end of this year. Thank you all for coming, and have a good evening or afternoon, or depending on where you are. Goodbye.